The year was 1816, and London glittered as though heaven itself had spilled its stars upon the city. Beneath 1,000 candles in the ballroom of Penfield House, the ton danced and gossiped, their laughter gilded with champagne and vanity. Music rose and fell like a tide of silver. Yet amidst a whirl of silk gowns and polished boots stood a woman whose quiet presence drew neither glance nor greeting. Lady Eleanor Whitcombe, eldest daughter of the once prestigious Whitcombe family, stood near a marble pillar, her fan unmoving, her smile faint as moonlight. She was 27 and, in the cruel arithmetic of society, long past the season of promise. Her sisters sparkled at the center of the room, draped in jewels and surrounded by suitors. Eleanor watched them with tender pride, though each compliment they received struck her heart like the tolling of a bell for what might have been. Her youngest sister, Clara, had recently been betrothed to Baron Eastleigh, a match celebrated in every gossip column from Mayfair to Bath. The middle sister, Arabella, had married a viscount the previous spring, her wedding carriage lined with white roses and admiration. And Eleanor, the firstborn, the dutiful, remained at home, tending her ailing mother and the failing accounts of Whitcombe Hall. It was said, not kindly, that she had exchanged her youth for responsibility and received nothing in return. She had heard it whispered at assemblies, seen it written in glances, felt it in every polite smile that pitied rather than admired. The Spinster of Whitcombe Hall, they called her, a title spoken behind fans, softened only by those who once envied her grace. A young lord, emboldened by wine, passed near her and murmured to his companion, a governess among diamonds. The jest earned laughter, light and merciless. Eleanor's hand trembled on her fan, though her expression did not change. Years of endurance had taught her silence, and silence, in its own way, had become her armor. Still, when she caught her reflection in the mirrored wall, the serene face, the composed figure in a gown of modest blue, she wondered whether she had indeed vanished beneath the weight of duty and time. She left the ballroom early, her departure unnoticed, and stepped into the cool night. The air carried the scent of lilac and rain. Carriages rattled beyond the gates as she entered the waiting coach. The Whitcombe crest dulled with age. Inside, the darkness was a mercy. As the horses began their journey home, she closed her eyes and allowed herself a single thought, that once, years ago, she had dreamed of a life lit by affection, not obligation. But those dreams had faded when her father's fortune dwindled, when her mother's health failed, when her sisters looked to her not as rival but guardian. A woman of sense, she had told herself, must accept her place in the world. Yet on nights like this, the ache of what she had surrendered felt as real as breath. Whitcombe Hall awaited her, grand once, now dignified in decay. The tapestries hung faded but clean, the silver polished though seldom used. Her father, Lord Whitcombe, had long since retired from society, his mind more occupied with accounts than guests. Her mother lay upstairs, a ghost of gentleness and fevered dreams, attended faithfully by Eleanor. The servants moved quietly, respectful of the house's silence. It was Eleanor who ensured its rhythm, she who wrote the letters, balanced the ledgers, chose the flowers for her mother's room. It was she who smiled when creditors called, who soothed her father's pride when debts came due. She bore these tasks with a calm dignity that others mistook for contentment. That night, as she undid the ribbons of her gown, her mother stirred and called her name. Eleanor sat beside the bed, brushing back a strand of gray hair from her mother's brow. "You are too good to us, my darling," the older woman whispered. "If only the world knew your worth." Eleanor smiled faintly. "The world prefers youth, Mama. Worth seldom enters its calculations." Her mother's eyes softened with sorrow. "Do not let them convince you that love has passed you by. There is more to life than being chosen." "I know," Eleanor murmured, though her heart did not entirely believe it. When her mother slept again, Eleanor moved to the window. Outside, the sky broke open with rain, tapping softly against the glass. Beyond the dark fields lay London, radiant and indifferent. Somewhere among its glittering halls, laughter still echoed. She watched the horizon until the candles burned low, until her reflection merged with the night. In the stillness, a single memory returned, the voice of a woman long gone, the Duchess of Ravenshire, who had once visited Whitcombe Hall and told a shy girl of 15, "Courage, child, is not the absence of fear, but the grace to endure it." The Duchess's son, the Duke of Ravenshire, had been scarcely older than Eleanor then, a young man with restless eyes who had spoken kindly to her while others ignored her. That brief kindness had lingered, a bright thread in the tapestry of her recollections, though she had not seen him since. Rumor claimed he had left England after a broken engagement, traveling to the colonies in pursuit of commerce or distraction. His name appeared occasionally in conversation, always wrapped in curiosity and admiration. The most desired man in England, the ladies called him, though none seemed to know the truth of his heart. Eleanor, brushing the thought aside, returned to her writing desk. A letter awaited her attention, an invitation sealed in emerald wax. She broke it open and read the flowing script. It was from Lady Penfield herself, announcing the forthcoming Midsummer Ball to be held at Ravenshire Manor, in honor of the Duke's return after 7 years abroad. Eleanor's breath caught. Ravenshire Manor, the very place she had once imagined only from tales. She traced the words again, uncertain why her pulse quickened. Surely it was nothing more than the memory of youth, stirring where it had long slept. She set the letter aside, yet sleep eluded her. Through the rain, the distant chime of a clock marked the passing of another hour. She thought of her sisters, Arabella with her charm, Clara with her laughter, and wondered whether they ever felt the weight of expectation pressing upon their happiness. For Eleanor, happiness had become a quiet discipline rather than a gift. She lived it through service, through the small decencies that stitched each day together. Still, beneath that calm exterior, there lay an unspoken yearning, to be seen, truly seen, not as daughter or caretaker, but as woman. By dawn, the storm had cleared, leaving the world washed in silver. The first light touched the curtains as she stood once more at the window. Far beyond the fields, a carriage road gleamed wet and empty, leading toward Ravenshire. The invitation lay on her desk, its seal glinting in the pale sun. She could almost hear her mother's words again. "There's more to life than being chosen." Perhaps. And yet, as she gazed at that road, she wondered whether fate, patient and unseen, might still remember her name. When she finally turned away, she carried herself with the same quiet composure that had long defined her. But somewhere beneath the calm, something faintly trembled awake. A question, a possibility, a spark not yet named. The morning light caught the edge of the letter, and the ink shimmered like a promise. The carriages began to arrive before dusk, wheels whispering over the long gravel approach to Ravenshire Manor. Lanterns glowed like captured fireflies along the drive, and the air trembled with expectation. The Midsummer Ball was to mark the Duke's return to England after 7 years abroad, a subject that had consumed the ton for weeks. Every lady longed to be noticed by him. Every gentleman wished to claim him as an acquaintance. Inside, the ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers, their light catching on silks, sapphires, and secret hopes. Among the guests stood Lady Eleanor Whitcombe, drawn more by duty than desire. Her sisters had insisted she attend, declaring that absence would appear ungrateful after the invitation had arrived so graciously addressed. She had agreed, though her heart felt curiously still. When she entered the ballroom, conversation faltered, as if the very air shifted. The Duke of Ravenshire had arrived. He was not the boy she remembered. No trace remained of the restless youth who once spoke gently to a shy girl in a country garden. Now he was composed, deliberate, his presence commanding attention without a word. His dark coat fit with military precision, his hair brushed back to reveal eyes of striking clarity, gray as morning frost and equally unreadable. Yet when those eyes found hers across the room, something almost imperceptible softened in his expression. He approached with the calm certainty of a man accustomed to being observed. The crowd, eager for spectacle, parted. "Lady Eleanor Whitcombe," he said, bowing with a courtesy that seemed to belong to another age. "It has been some years." She curtsied, her voice steady though her pulse betrayed her. "7, your grace." "Too many," he replied, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. "And yet you are unchanged." The words might have been polite, but there was an undertone in them, something like recognition, or perhaps regret. Before she could answer, a young countess nearby whispered audibly to her companion, "The Duke wastes his first words on her?" Laughter, muffled behind fans, followed. Eleanor's composure held, though she felt the familiar sting of humiliation. The Duke's gaze flickered toward the source of the remark, then back to her. "London," he said quietly, "remains as cruel as I remember." He extended his arm. "Will you walk with me, my lady?" A turn about the room may distract us both from less worthy conversation. She hesitated only a moment before accepting. Around them, curiosity bloomed like wildfire. The Duke, who had ignored the most dazzling beauties of the season, was seen speaking, almost intently, to the eldest Miss Whitcombe. Their steps were measured, their conversation light, but the glances exchanged between them were noticed by all. For Eleanor, the moment felt unreal, a fragile echo of some forgotten dream. Yet beneath her calm demeanor, her thoughts were racing. What did he see in her, after all these years? What motive lay behind his sudden attention? She dared not believe in chance. The ton, she knew, would not. When the dance concluded, he bowed again. "You bear London's scrutiny with remarkable grace," he said. "One might think you have practiced patience as an art." "One does what one must," she answered softly. "Society offers little else to those it deems unremarkable." "Unremarkable?" His brow lifted, almost in amusement. "Then I must disagree with society for the first time this evening." Before she could reply, he stepped away to greet another guest. Yet when she returned to her seat, a footman approached, bowing low. Upon her fan lay a single white rose, freshly cut, its petals still cool with dew. "From His Grace, madam," the servant murmured. She froze. It was the simplest of gestures, yet in that ballroom, where every token carried meaning, it was an act of quiet rebellion. Around her, whispers rose. The Duke had given no lady a flower, not even those who had crossed oceans for his notice. Now he had offered one to the eldest Whitcombe. Lady Penfield, presiding over the evening like a queen in silk, leaned toward a companion and murmured something that sent ripples of laughter through the line of matrons. By the next morning, every drawing-room in London would repeat the story with embellishments, that Eleanor had contrived to attract him, that she had worn his mother's favorite color, that perhaps she had written to him in secret. She felt the sting of eyes upon her and wished, for the first time that night, to disappear. Yet when she lifted the rose, its faint fragrance calmed her. Perhaps he had meant nothing by it. Perhaps it was kindness, nothing more. But kindness, in her world, was a rarity almost divine. As the evening wore on, the whispers sharpened. A lady known for her malice, the Duchess of Marrow, approached, her smile sugared with poison. "How curious, Lady Eleanor, that the Duke should remember you. He must possess an extraordinary memory for childhood acquaintances." "I imagine he remembers what others choose to forget," Eleanor replied evenly. The Duchess's expression faltered, but only for a moment. "Take care, my dear," she said sweetly. "The world is not kind to women who reach beyond their station. Men such as he delight in small amusements, not permanence." The words pierced, though Eleanor merely inclined her head. "I thank you for your concern, your grace. I assure you I am not so easily amused." The Duchess swept away, her laughter trailing like perfume. Eleanor's heart beat unsteadily. She had endured whispers before, but this was different. The weight of public scrutiny pressed against her like iron. She wished to leave, yet her sisters insisted upon another dance, another polite conversation. Only when thunder rolled faintly beyond the windows did she seize her chance to slip into the corridor, the rose still clasped in her hand. Outside, the night was warm and scented with rain. She descended the marble steps toward the waiting carriages, each breath a battle for composure. The storm gathered on the horizon, pale lightning flickering behind distant hills. She had almost reached her coach when a voice halted her. "Leaving so soon, Lady Eleanor?" She turned. The Duke stood beneath the portico, a dark silhouette against the golden light behind him. His expression held no surprise, only quiet certainty. "I find storms preferable to gossip," she said, managing a smile. He descended the steps until they stood a breath apart. "Then allow me to offer you my carriage." I would not have your good name, or your gown, suffer for society's entertainment. Your Grace, the scandal is already written. Then let it be written truthfully, he replied, that I escorted you home, with honor. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain began to fall, soft and cool. At last she nodded, and he offered his arm. The drive from Ravenshire to Whitcombe Hall was quiet save for the steady rhythm of hooves. Candlelight flickered inside the carriage, throwing gentle shadows across his face. Forgive society, he said at last, his voice low. It mistakes silence for weakness, and kindness for ambition. I have learned the error of both. She looked at him then, searching for mockery, and finding none. You speak as though from experience. I speak as one who has seen how fragile reputation can be, he answered, and how easily truth is buried beneath applause. When the carriage drew to a halt, he helped her down, his hand lingering for a moment longer than custom allowed. Good night, Lady Eleanor, he said, and thank you for reminding me that grace still exists. Before she could reply, he was gone, the carriage wheels fading into the rain. She stood at the gate, the white rose pressed to her heart, uncertain whether to fear or cherish what had just begun. Inside the manor, a single candle burned in the window, and as she crossed the threshold, she knew that the calm order of her life had ended. Something unspoken had entered it, quiet, impossible, and irreversible. Autumn descended gently upon Whitcombe Hall, softening its decay beneath a veil of gold and quiet. The fields turned copper, the air crisp with the scent of harvest, and the days shortened into thoughtful evenings. Lady Eleanor Whitcombe had settled once more into the rhythm of duty. The letters, the ledgers, the long walks between her mother's chamber and the garden. Yet, beneath her composure, there stirred a disquiet she could neither name nor silence. Weeks had passed since the Midsummer Ball, yet the memory of the Duke's gaze, steady and unflinching in the carriage's dim light, haunted her still. The white rose had long since withered, but she had not found it in her heart to discard it. One afternoon, as mist rolled low over the lawns, a carriage appeared at the distant gates. Its crest gleamed faintly in the pale sun, Ravenshire. She stood at the window, uncertain whether to retreat or wait. When the servant announced a visitor, her father's voice rose in sudden vigor, welcoming the Duke into the study. It was said his Grace had come to discuss a boundary matter concerning the Whitcombe estate, yet Eleanor sensed at once that this was but pretext. When she entered the drawing room, he stood by the window, gloved hands clasped behind his back. Lady Eleanor, he said, turning toward her with that same quiet composure she remembered, I hope I do not intrude. On the contrary, your Grace, she replied, steadying her voice. Whitcombe Hall has known few callers of late. My father is honored by your visit. And you, he asked softly. I find myself surprised. Then I have achieved something worthwhile today, he said, smiling faintly. They sat opposite each other, a small fire burning between them. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping against the window panes like a polite reminder of the world beyond. For a moment neither spoke. The silence was not awkward, only weighted, filled with the quiet awareness that every word mattered. He began, at last, with the language of business, describing the estate's boundaries, the rites of passage, the state of the nearby river. His tone was measured, his words precise. Yet as he spoke, she saw the shadow of distraction cross his features, the kind born not of calculation, but of thought. When he paused, she said gently, You did not come to speak of rivers, your Grace. He met her gaze, and something in him yielded. No, he admitted. I came to speak of the night I left you at your gates, and the days since, which have refused to let me forget it. The firelight caught in the silver threads of his hair, and she thought he looked suddenly older, not from age, but from a weight carried too long. You risk much in saying so, she whispered. I have risked less for far greater follies, he replied, and I am weary of silence. Eleanor lowered her eyes to her hands, folded neatly in her lap. Silence, she said, is the only shield left to those whom society has already wounded. Then let it wound me too, he said. I would rather share your exile than live amid the clamor of empty praise. His words unsettled her, for they spoke directly to the ache she had long buried. "Do not speak lightly, your grace. You are admired, envied. The world bends kindly toward you." He laughed quietly, a sound without mirth. "You think admiration is kindness? It is a performance, Lady Eleanor, and I am tired of my role. I have seen how quickly affection turns to contempt when fashion demands it. I have learned how easily the heart is traded for applause." She looked up then, meeting his gaze fully. "You speak as though you have been betrayed." "I have," he said simply. "Not by one person, but by a world that measures worth in spectacle. Once, I thought to marry for alliance, for beauty, for all the things a man of rank is told to value. But those pursuits left me hollow. I left England to escape it, to seek meaning elsewhere. And yet, when I returned, it was your face I remembered, your composure at the ball when they mocked you. I have known courage in battlefields, Lady Eleanor, but never in silence until that night." She felt her throat tighten. "You mistake endurance for courage. I endure because there is no alternative. Then you are stronger than I, for I have fled what you have borne." The fire crackled softly, filling the pause between them. She wished, absurdly, that time might slow, that this strange intimacy might remain suspended in its fragile balance. Yet she could not allow herself to believe too easily. "What is it you seek from me, your grace?" "Not forgiveness," he said, "and not pity. Only truth. And if my truth should wound you, then it will have been worth hearing." She drew a breath. "Very well. My truth, then. I have lived my life beneath the weight of expectation. My sisters married well. My parents looked to me to preserve what little dignity remained. I became invisible so they might shine. I learned to be grateful for neglect, to find pride in being overlooked. And yet," she faltered, the words catching in her throat, "I am not without longing. I fear the world has convinced me that to be loved is a privilege I have forfeited." The Duke's expression softened, his voice barely above a whisper. "No heart forfeits what it was made to give. You have not been unloved, Lady Eleanor, only unseen." Her composure broke then, not in tears, but in a trembling of the hands. She turned toward the fire, letting its warmth steady her. "If I were foolish, I might think you mean what you say, but I have lived long enough to know that pity often masquerades as affection." "Then you must believe I am neither fool nor hypocrite," he said, rising. He moved to stand near her, the light casting his shadow long across the hearth. "I speak not out of pity, but recognition. You possess what society cannot imitate, dignity without arrogance, grace without vanity. You make quiet into strength. Do you know how rare that is?" She could not answer. The moment stretched, heavy and breathless. He reached into his coat and drew forth a folded letter. "I leave tomorrow for Ravenshire," he said, placing it gently upon the mantel. "This is not a proposal, nor a declaration. It is a truth written in words I cannot yet speak aloud. Read it when courage allows." Their eyes met once more, and in that gaze was something deeper than sentiment, a promise of understanding that defied language. He bowed slightly, his voice low. "If dignity forbids me to speak, my heart shall kneel in its place." When he was gone, the silence returned, vast and shimmering. She stood motionless, the sound of the rain merging with the faint echo of his words. The fire burned low, casting the room in a trembling glow. At last, she reached for the letter, feeling the seal still warm from his hand. She did not open it, not yet. Instead, she held it close, her breath unsteady, her composure broken at last by the quiet certainty that her life had begun to change. The world beyond still whispered its judgments, but within her something fierce and living had awakened, a spark that refused to be silenced, waiting only for dawn. The night of the Midsummer Ball arrived with a hush of anticipation that seemed to ripple through every corner of Whitcombe Hall. Carriages gleamed like dark jewels under the lantern-lit drive, and laughter spilled across the manicured lawns as the county's most distinguished families gathered to mark the season's grandest celebration. The air was thick with perfume and expectation. Eleanor stood at the head of the staircase, her hands trembling around the folds of a pale ivory gown that had once belonged to her mother. For years, she had avoided such occasions, yet tonight, she felt the weight of something inevitable pressing upon her heart. The music floated upward from the ballroom below, the violins swelling like the tide. From her vantage point, she could see the flicker of candlelight mirrored in polished silver and glass. The Duke of Ravenshire had returned only a month before, and his name had not left a single drawing-room conversation since. Even now, she could hear murmurs drift up from the guests below. Some wondered if he would choose a bride this season. Others whispered that his eyes had lingered far too long on the eldest Whitcombe daughter during his last visit. Eleanor steadied her breath, ignoring the flutter of those whispers that once stung so deeply. When the herald announced his arrival, a subtle shift moved through the crowd, the kind of reverent silence reserved for someone of immense power. The Duke entered, his presence commanding without effort. He was dressed in black evening attire, with a single white rose pinned to his lapel, the very emblem of Ravenshires' lineage. But it was not the rose that drew every gaze. It was the stillness with which he surveyed the room until his eyes found hers. For a heartbeat, the music faltered in her chest. The Duke inclined his head with a smile that carried both warmth and intent. He began to ascend the staircase, step by deliberate step, while the guests watched in growing astonishment. Eleanor could feel her pulse quicken, each beat a question. Why her before all others? When he reached her side, he bowed. "Lady Eleanor," he said softly, the words threaded with admiration, "might I have the honor of your first dance?" Gasps murmured through the hall. Her sisters, radiant in silk and jewels, stood frozen in disbelief. No man had ever sought Eleanor first, and certainly not a duke. Yet in that moment, she neither fled nor hesitated. She took his gloved hand, allowing him to lead her toward the ballroom floor, where the candles blazed and the crowd parted like a tide before them. The orchestra began anew, and together they moved beneath the chandeliers, two figures poised between memory and promise. The Duke's hand rested lightly at her back, guiding her with a precision that felt both protective and reverent. "Do you hear them?" he murmured. "The whispers." "I have heard them all my life," she replied, her voice barely a breath. "And yet you stand taller than any here," he said. "When I was abroad, it was not the splendor of London I recalled, but the image of a woman who held her family's ruin together with her bare hands. I have seen courage in soldiers, Lady Eleanor, but not of this kind." Her throat tightened, emotion rising swift and dangerous. "You speak too kindly, Your Grace." "I speak plainly," he countered. "I have returned for one purpose, to ask if you might ever forgive the world for failing to see what I see now." The music swelled, and for a moment she dared not answer. The Duke's gaze held her like a vow, steady, unwavering, and filled with a tenderness that defied the glittering cruelty around them. As the final note faded, the hall erupted in applause. But he did not release her hand. Instead, he led her away from the watching eyes, through the arched doors that opened onto the moonlit terrace. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of roses from the garden below. Fireflies shimmered like tiny embers in the darkness. Eleanor turned toward him, her heart trembling under the weight of the moment. "Why would you risk their scorn?" she asked. "You, who could have any lady of the realm?" He stepped closer, his voice low. "Because I have already known admiration," he said, "but I have never known peace. And in your presence, I find both." The words struck her like sunlight through a storm. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, folded paper, aged, creased, and sealed with his signet. "When I left England 5 years ago," he said, "I carried this with me. It was a letter I never sent, a promise I never made. I wrote it after our first conversation. On that afternoon you lent me your father's books and spoke of constellations. I knew then, though I was too proud to admit it." Her hand trembled as she took the letter. "And now I am no longer proud," he said simply, "only certain." Eleanor's eyes glistened. She turned toward the hall, where laughter still rang through the open windows. For years she had watched her sisters move in that world, gilded, admired, and envied, while she remained unseen. And now, standing in the moonlight with the most desired man in England, she felt no triumph, only quiet astonishment that love had found her not in vanity, but in truth. The Duke sank to one knee, not as a gesture of spectacle, but of solemn devotion. The sight drew a gasp from the terrace guests, who had followed unseen. His voice was steady as he spoke. "Lady Eleanor Whitcombe, I ask not for your name nor your fortune, but for the chance to be your companion through all that remains. Will you, despite the world's memory of your solitude, share what peace may be left to us?" Tears glimmered in her eyes as she whispered, "Yes." Applause rippled from the terrace doors, not mockery now, but wonder. Inside, her sisters watched, their envy softened into awe. The tongue that once scorned her now bore witness to a different kind of triumph, the quiet victory of a woman who had waited with grace. As the orchestra resumed within, the Duke rose, taking her hand once more. "The night is young," he murmured, smiling. "Shall we show them what devotion truly looks like?" Eleanor smiled through her tears. Together, they re-entered the ballroom, where candles burned low and hearts burned brighter. The whispers that had once wounded her now carried a different tone, reverent, uncertain, and filled with envy. And when they danced again, there was no question left unanswered, no heart left unspoken. The Spinster of Whitcombe Hall was no more. In her place stood the Duchess of Ravenshire, beloved not for her youth or dowry, but for the quiet courage that had, at last, taught even the proudest of England's hearts to kneel.